Hi, my name is Chanya and thank you for joining me today. We're going to go over the most basic of woven tops.
A tank top with darts.
If you know how to balance one of these, you can balance most anything with a set end sleeve. It's a very basic tank top, and you can already see that there are some issues with it. Mainly there's this very bad drag line here, and the back is again shorter than the front. And this happens a lot. People just aren't balancing things properly from front to back and making sure they're level. It can also be affected if you are using someone with a smaller or a bigger bust. Again, we are fitting on a size 6 with a 34B cup, but some people choose to use a smaller or a bigger fit model. So I'm going to talk to you today about the difference between pinning and cutting and pinning. As you know, I always prefer to cut because I feel you get a more accurate measurement of how much you have to change things. So if I was going to pin this garment, and sometimes you get a sales sample and you can't cut it, then I would just do this. I would tell the pattern maker to pick up the back to get rid of this collapsing here. And you do that by just picking up the back all the way across from armhole to armhole. When you tell a pattern maker to pick up, you have to be very aware of what you're actually saying. Because I've seen people just pick up in the middle of a garment or someplace where there's not seams. I've also seen people pick up on a sleeveless garment or something off shoulder and not really understanding what they're asking for. So if you just want to say pick up and you're pinning, this looks like it needs a 1/2 inch pickup all the way across. A lot of technical designers will just leave it at this and go forward. So ask to pick up the back, drop the armhole back to spec, and then just ask for the hem to be even all the way around. So that's the quick and easy version of how to correct this garment. Something you'd probably do in a fitting. But I actually like to show the pattern maker exactly where and what to correct in the armhole. Because again, you're still collapsing right here. And you see that it's coning. That's because this fullness isn't being distributed properly around the body. Once I get it back to my desk, I would actually mark it and unpin it. And then I would start investigating what is actually wrong with this garment. There's a lot of problem at both the shoulder and the side seam. The shoulder doesn't have the pull lines that I showed in my first video, but because the front shoulder is not sitting properly in relationship to the back shoulder, this gets rotated out the shoulder and then it collapses. So I'm going to cut and pin where it actually needs to go. I also want to point out that whereas the side seam is vertical and where it should be, your shoulder seam is sitting about 3/4 inch back from the shoulder line on the form. So I'm cutting and maintaining that seam allowance. And I'm going to move that shoulder, that back shoulder, up to the shoulder line because that's where it should actually sit. And then you can see that both the shoulder slope and the position of the front to back shoulder is a little off. Not much. I'd probably build up the front neckline 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch just so that the front shoulder sits where it should. So I'll show you the difference. This is the front shoulder built up at the neck, and this is where it's pulled up back to where it originally is. So drag lines, fewer drag lines. And that all has to do with shoulder slope and the relationship of front to back shoulder. There's also a problem because the pattern might actually be okay, but the sewer might have put on a binding that's just a 1/2 inch too short at the neckline. So it could be a construction problem or it could be a pattern problem. Right now, we're just going to treat it like it's a pattern problem. You can tell if the binding is too short because you can actually just pinch out a little extra fabric there. I want to show this excess fabric that's being forced into the binding at both the neck and the armhole. Put the shoulder where it should be, and then I look at the side seam. And this dart now is at a correct place. Before it was pretty high. All right, so now that I've dropped that armhole, this is a pretty good place for that armhole to sit. Whereas on the other side, it's pretty high and not very comfortable. But that still leaves a drag line right here. And I'm going to show you how to correct that by cutting up the side seam and manipulating that dart. I've cut up the side seam, and now I'm going to look at where the back panel actually wants to sit. You see that the armhole actually wants to sit pretty high, and it causes some drag here. Again, I feel like the binding is just a little short for this garment. If the binding was relaxed and this armhole got to sit a little lower, you wouldn't have this dragging here. And also, I'm going to show you a close-up right now that there's rippling at the back armhole. So the whole back panel is being forced into binding that is too small for it. So there you can see all this rippling here and the drag line there. So if I actually cut the binding, you'll see where the back panel wants to sit. And this is akin to cutting off the sleeve to let the panels sit where they want to. Anytime you have a seam or binding, it can contract the fabric and force it to do something that the pattern is not wanting it to do. So you can already see that there's a little bit of a difference between the binding and the self armhole. Basically, they're not using the correct stitch tension when they sew this garment. And you might think that because it's a woven garment, you would just use the same basic stitch tension, but use different stitch tension if it's cotton, if it's silk, the density of the fabric, how heavy it is, all sorts of things. I smooth out the shoulder, and I smooth around the front of the armhole. All right, now I can see that the front armhole, again, wants to sit higher than the back armhole. And now I'm gonna pick up into this dart a little bit. But let's look at where it actually wants to sit. Okay, so I released that dart, and we're gonna look at how much should actually be picked up. Here I pinned where I wanted at the point and where I wanted at the side seam. It's about 1/2 inch lower at the point and about 3/4 inch lower at the side seam. And then I connect those two pins. And then I check to make sure that the collapsing is gone. And there still is some collapsing that you can see here. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more. So what happens if you pick up too much into the dart? It starts to pull the fabric up, and instead of collapsing, there's drag lines from the dart. So it's kind of an art and kind of a science, knowing exactly how much to pick up into darts. Okay, so I repositioned the pins, and now it's straight here. But I want to make sure that the coning is also gone. And I feel like there's just too much collapsing still going on at the point of the dart. I still want to pick up a little bit, but because you can't make the dart too big, I normally don't go over 3.5 inches. I'm going to start manipulating it at the shoulder. So by rotating in the front shoulder, what I'm doing is I'm saying to the pattern maker, I want a smaller armhole. This will rotate back out to match the back shoulder. So it's a smaller circumference, and then the body kind of pulls the armhole out and things fall back into the place that they should be. So now, front is hanging flat, there's no coning at the dart, and there is puckering at the end of the dart, but that's just because you're working with pins and not an actual seam. So the front armhole is where it should be. The back armhole now is only the width of that binding. So once you sew the binding on, it's at the correct place. So I pin the front to the back at the seam allowance. I can just see that overall, this side just drapes better than this side. But because of that imbalance at the front and the back side seam, I would increase the front length at the side, 1/2 inch, and then that back length, I only have to increase 1/4 inch. So that's what I mean when I say pick up the back. And you actually don't end up doing anything to the back at all, except moving it forward to make sure it sits at the correct place. So I'm going to show you now what the difference is close up of the front and back shoulder. And it looks like the front shoulder could swing out 1/4 inch and fill in 1/2 inch at the high point. The back I can leave alone. Now when I lay the garment out flat to take pictures of it, I'm gonna mark the dart. I already marked the dart where it originally was, and I'm gonna show them where I want it to be. And I'm gonna take a picture of the whole front side. So when I take a picture of the back, I want to definitely show them how much smaller the binding is than the actual garment. And again, that's where you see a lot of the rippling at the seams and at the armhole and neck. So hopefully this demonstration of how to balance a basic tank gives you the basis for all the styles we're going to be doing with sit and sleeves. Thank you for joining me today, and remember to like and subscribe.